Hey guys, what's up? threads13 here for deucescrack.com, coming to you today with another episode of Ask threads13. This one is kind of a continuation on the previous episode where we were talking about things that we want to do to start increasing our win rate at the micros. And so this is the second part of a little mini series which I've aptly named things you aren't doing to beat the micros. And this one is sort of the subtitle, More Barreling. And we're going to continue on this sort of same topic as last time and about finding more board textures where we can be barreling versus looser players. And by looser players, I don't mean guys that are going to be absolutely calling you down with everything. So if a guy's got like an 80% VPIP, you're going to want to be a little bit more careful about these sort of ideas because they really, really, really don't fold. And then the strategy versus them is really simple, and you just flop top pair and just keep betting. But the guys who are playing somewhere in the middle there with those, 40% VPIPs and things like that, they play too many hands for sure, but they often get away from hands before calling down three streets. They'll still call down three streets with maybe too many hands given the type of strategies that tags typically use at these stakes. And by that I mean many tags at these stakes don't really three barrel bluff the river with as high of a frequency as they should. Meaning when they bet the flop, bet the turn, bet the river, they've got like a nutted sort of hand, something we'd certainly call, air quotes, value bet, maybe 80 to 90% of the time. So them calling with like top pair weak kicker is not going to be the greatest idea in those sort of situations. So cool. So let's get into it. So the idea is that these sort of players who are playing, slightly too loose, but not super crazy loose, they fold on later streets a whole bunch. And they usually don't fold, obviously, like a whole bunch pre-flop, and they usually don't fold a whole bunch on the flop. In general, they'll find lots of reasons to hang around on the flop. And this is, reiterating things I said in the first episode here, is that they typically will fold a decent amount on turns and rivers. You just got to look at the board texture and try to predict that. So it's really, I can't say that enough, is this going to be looking at the board texture and trying to use that to help estimate fold percentages. I think that's a little bit better, not a little bit better, I think it's like a way lot better, than just kind of saying, these guys are going to call me down. Well, on some boards they are going to be calling a lot, and some guys will be calling a lot, and some guys won't be calling a lot. But we can use the board texture to get us started, until we know better, know more about our specific opponent. And even if we do know a lot about our specific opponent, the board texture itself will help us a ton. So that's going to be really the focus of these episodes, is looking a lot at board textures. If we know a lot about our opponent and know that he folds every turn under the sun, no matter what, which is a little bit weird to know that. I mean, how many times have you guys really known that in your lives? But if you knew that, then we all could agree that the strategy is super simple: to barrel all of your air. And then this episode would be over and we all move on with our lives. But poker doesn't really work out that way. What it works out is being more like, and I know I'm kind of beating a dead horse here, is that it comes down to looking at board textures, and on certain board textures, people tend to fold more and less. And it's looking at those board textures and tendencies of people as what that, and these sort of loose people and even tags too, but I'm kind of focusing on some of the slightly looser players for today's episode, and sort of estimating those frequencies based on board textures. So that's probably about 5 times I've said that now. So that's going to be the big focus today, looking for some spots to barrel, especially on the button. Everything's greater on the button, of course, but this is particularly nice because we're going to have position guaranteed, obviously, since we're on the button. But this is going to be particularly good for barreling because it sort of allows you to take the top of people's ranges out a little easier, because people, even passive people, will tend to kind of give you some sort of clue when they have some sort of nutted hand, check raise the flop, check raise the turn, donk the river or something, so that you don't end up three barreling into the nuts quite as often. So this, um, and them being out of position, of course, will maybe get some extra folds. So, these sort of guys, they call the flop and then fold, maybe to turn, maybe to river, depends on the specific board texture, but they're going to do that a lot. And the second point here is that even tags, even if they see that you're doing this, they don't typically have, like know what they're supposed to do about it to stop you. Um, so so don't be shy. Don't wimp out. So if you're looking at a board texture and you're thinking this is going to be a good spot where he's going to tend to be folding a lot, and go ahead and maybe err on the side of a little bit too much aggression in these sort of situations. I think it's okay. It's just a lot of guys, and this, again, we're talking specifically about the micro stakes, is, more tags than, more often than not, tags will tend to fold. Um, and they don't tend to make some hero calls, and yeah, they will sometimes, and you'll feel goofy. But the question is it more profitable than not profitable? And I think the answer is a resounding yes. Which kind of brings me to my next point is, about getting called. Um, we all have this one time the fish called you down with some sort of crazy hand, or the tag called you down with something you didn't expect, or he shoved over your four bet and you called and showed you 7-5 suited, like all that sort of stuff. Everybody has that story. And part of the reason that we have that story is it's super memorable, if that's a word, super memorable when it happens. So we remember it and we run and we tell our friends and all that good stuff. But the thing is the times that you've got like ace ace, the flop comes king 8-3, you bet the flop and you bet the turn. You don't run and tell your friends about how awesome that was. It's kind of boring. And the same thing goes if you triple barrel and then they fold. It's kind of boring. So what I'm getting at here is you don't see what they fold. And there's a lot of times they're folding these middle pair hands, or of course folding busted draws, and maybe they're folding top pair and stuff like that. And it's online poker, and they don't fold face up all that often, almost ever. So you don't really get to see what's going on there. You only remember the times that didn't work out. So what we want to do is try to be more aware of like how frequently you're getting folds in these sort of spots. Um, and, you know, even you can kind of look at it as like, if I had a big hand here and I bet, how often do I see myself getting calls here? You know, when I three barrel top pair, do I get called a lot or do I just see them fold a lot? Um, Now you got some blockers in there, so it's not, super 100% accurate, but we'll certainly give you an idea of what's kind of going on in these situations. Um, just because you see somebody call you down well, let me rephrase that. Just because somebody has called down with third pair in the history of time doesn't necessarily make it a bad idea for you to triple barrel bluff. Yes, sometimes people are going to call with some trashy stuff. Um, but that doesn't mean everybody does it. So on that note, let's go ahead and we are going to jump into a few examples and take a look at these things and show you guys some spots where we can be trying to find some extra folds. Okay, guys, so the first flop that I want to take a look at here is listed on the bottom right here in Notepad. We have a 10-7-2 rainbow flop. And in this situation, I've assumed that we have opened on the button and we are getting called in the big blind by, loosey goosey sort of player. You can see that his pre-flop range has a bunch of stuff like this. And I've taken out some of the premium hands, assuming that he will 3-bet them. Most loose players don't really 3-bet that much, so I'm not really taking out like a lot of the premiums, which of course helps, or actually, sorry, hurts the idea of running multiple barrels. So this, kind of makes it a little bit more pessimistic, you know, hurts our EV, post flop. So there's a couple points I want to talk about on a 10-7-2 sort of board texture is, one thing is that right off the bat, it's just hard for your opponent to hit it. He plays some 10s and some 7s, not a lot of 2s as you can see. And yeah, there's some 6s through some 3s. So he's not going to hit this board that much. And if you look at it here, I've just put, top pair better in a group, middle pair better, or middle pair in a group, bottom pair in a group, good draws. On this board, I'm just calling that 9-8 basically. Gut shots in a group, and some naked overs that I might call with in a group. So this ungrouped stuff is the stuff that I believe he'll be folding most of the time. And so that leaves him folding right off the bat about 45% of the time. And you see, maybe, I have him calling with just like any queen jack suited. Now maybe he calls with queen jack sometimes, queen jack offsuit that is. But he also doesn't necessarily call with queen jack suited 100%. So I think more often than not, he probably folds those hands. But I have him calling with like any ace jack and any ace queen. So I think this, is reasonable. So you can see, we're certainly not like, it's not like he's only folding 25% of the time on the flop here. I mean, it's kind of a stretch to get that, without some sort of read. And we might learn about that very quickly, if we see something like that. So cool. So another thing I like to point out on this sort of flop is that you will see a lot of overcards roll off. So even if your opponent did happen to flop a top pair sort of hand, which he's only done 17% of the time, and that includes 2-pair and sets, is it's going to be pretty easy for him to get overcarded. And we can do the math over here quickly and easily in our calculator, and that's why I have that set up for, is how easy is it for him to get overcarded? Well, aces, kings, queens, and jacks, there's 4 of those. Those are the overcards out of the 13 ranks in the deck. So it's easier to work this backwards and just say that there's 9 ranks that won't overcard him and divide by 13. So that's the probability that he won't be overcarded on the turn. So 70% of the time, roughly, he won't be overcarded on the turn. And the way that we do this is we can just square this to see how, and this is roughly, but close enough. We square this, and that'll be how often he doesn't get overcarded on the turn or the river. So, turn and the river? Yeah, whatever it is, so he never sees an overcard. So 48% of the time he will not get overcarded. So therefore, 52% of the time he's going to get overcarded. So we can start seeing quickly a couple things here. One, we're going to get a decent amount of folds on the flop. 2, we're going to get a lot of help from the board to put pressure on him, even when he has some of his best hands. And he doesn't have some of his best hands all that often. So you can start to see, if we look at his range, even if we imagine that the turn runs off like a dud, like a 3, we're probably going to get like these gutters to fold. We're probably going to get these bottom pairs to fold. Obviously not 3-3, but and not 3-2, but we're going to get a good chunk of those bottom pairs to fold. The naked overs will mostly fold. Yeah, all those fold for the most part. So you're gonna get a good chunk of folds here in those sort of situations. We got 9 from the naked overs, 6 from the gut shots, so that's 15. Bottom pair, 8, and that's out of the 55. 22 out of 55. I'm getting the 55 from here, so actually this will be easier for you guys to see. is he's basically going to be folding most of this stuff kind of on the top, the bottom pair, probably not the good draws. Um, Almost certainly not the good draws. Gut shots and naked overs. So you can see that's 26 plus 13, 39% of the time, just on a dud of a turn. Um, and then you can kind of see that for the most part, we're kind of getting called by middle pair and top pairs, probably fair. Um, that's going to at least be a very high portion of his range, and it's going to be reasonable to expect that we can maybe get him off middle pair, which is about half of his turn range there. Because you can see he's got about equal portions of middle pair and top pair, and we'll be able to get him off the draws as long as we don't, as long as it's not sixes and jacks and things like that. So, on the flip side, the jack isn't so bad because it overcards the top pair, and now maybe we get some folds from them and get a higher percentage fold from the middle pair. Because like on another three river, maybe middle pair doesn't fold 100%, but maybe on a jack river it does. So it's probably fair to assume that it folds a little bit higher percentage of the time as we work through these things. So as you see, I mean, it's going to be a lot of board textures where we're gonna a lot of turn and rivers, I should say, a lot of runouts where we are going to get folds, above 40% of the time on the turn and the river. So we're going to get lots of folds, as is, and there's some times where like it comes king queen, for example, and that's pretty nice for us, and it's going to be pretty rare that your opponent's going to call you down in that situation. Those are going to be the times that he's like, peeled the flop with king queen, hit a king, river to queen, like that kind of stuff. Turn two pair, check called it. Like those are sort of times that you're going to get some call downs and have that third barrel not work. But yeah, more often than not, you're going to just his hand is not going to make it to the river if you just keep putting aggression on. So this is a good board texture, really, for you to kind of start firing away. I don't think you necessarily need like a equity a whole bunch here for you to be betting. So when you're on the button on these sort of boards. Okay, so let's take a look at another board texture. Okay, so here's the second board texture that we are looking at. And this one's kind of continuing that same example, but in a little different way. A lot of you guys see bet this flop right off the bat, and I'm here to confirm that's a pretty good idea. You can see even against a guy who likes to call a lot on the flop, if he's calling you with all ace highs and all pairs, or better, of course, then he's going to be folding 58% of the time. Now, we can kind of play around with it and see what it looks like. What if he calls you with like his, his king queens and his king jacks and his queen jacks, for example. And we're still getting like 50% folds on the flop. And what you want to see actually that's going on this board, is that your opponent, when he calls, has nothing. And it has to do with the fact that he doesn't play that many fives or that many twos. So if we look at his range here, and we now split it up into he has a pair or he doesn't. So I'm just going to put group 2 here. I'm just going to put it into pair or better. And all these are pairs. And all of these are pairs. So let's go here. It's a little easier to see it on a chart. And you can see that he usually doesn't have anything when he peels you on the flop here. If you're playing against a loose player, he's going to peel this flop a lot. This might be slightly exaggerated. Like, so we can kind of take it back to the original example here where we kind of take out these king high and queen high calls. But still, like 60% of his range will be unpaired when he calls you. And of course, most of those things are bricking on, the average turn card. Aces, as you can see, are actually not good cards to barrel. A lot of times people just go, wee, it's an ace, so it's scary. Not that simple. As you can see here, that your opponent hits the ace like constantly on the turn. So don't bet an ace turn. but most other turns are going to be okay, you know. On average, I mean, an unpaired hand's only got 6 outs, so I mean, you know, he's missing a turn like 80, 90% of the time, depending on if he's got backdoor draws or gutters and things like that. So your opponent's pretty much breaking the turn here a whole bunch. So betting on the turn is going to be a pretty good idea to two barrel here. Um, and furthermore, it's going to be a pretty good idea for you to think about three barreling versus a lot of guys here, fish as well. One, you'll often get check raised or donked somewhere along the line when they happen to have the five. Um, for the most part, you know, I mean, obviously you can't be certain about these things, and we're talking about, you know, making assumptions about unknowns. But that's pretty often the case is you'll get a donk or a check raise or something. Probably usually a check raise. If it's a donk, a lot of times it ends up coming on the river. But that's something you'll see pretty often here. So when you get called on the flop, called on the turn, a lot of times you're looking at the old pair of sixes, which is like already been overcarded once. Because I mean, if you look at this board, the only way a pair of sixes hasn't been overcarded is if it one made a boat, or two was a four or a three, a five or a two. So you can see like what it's like 75, 80% of the turn cards have overcarded him with those sort of hands. So he's going to get overcarded here a lot. Even if he's at the top end of that where he has like Jack Jack, that's going to get overcarded. I mean, we saw how often a 10 gets an overcard. You know, a Jack is going to get an overcard here, I think by the river about 40% of the time. So a lot of his, if we just look at the board texture again, this is kind of the big theme of today's episode. Look at the board texture and try to predict what's going to happen ahead of time. Is even if your opponent happens to have something, which is rare, he's going to get overcarded and probably not call you down. So, or he's going to have ace high and probably miss the turn. And so we kind of have, it's going to go, you're going to bet and they're going to have nothing and they'll fold. Or they have like ace high or a pair. And if you two barrel, they'll fold their ace highs for the most part, unless they pair up. So that's lots of folding on the turn. Sometimes you get raised at this point when they have monsters. And then they call again. Now, sometimes they lead into you on a river when they have the monster. And if, and when they call, otherwise they often have a pair, but now they often don't have an overpair or anything like that. And they may be looking at two overcards, but often one with most of their range. So it's very hard for them to be calling down with, say, 7-7 on 5-5-2, 10 Jack. You're just not going to get called down there very often by people. Now I'm not trying to make a theoretical mathematical note on whether they should or shouldn't. I'm just saying on these sort of board textures, people typically don't call down with those sort of hands at the micros. Therefore, you get a lot of folds. Therefore, it's a good spot for you to be three barreling. So now the kind of common theme we saw between these last two boards is very different than what we did in the previous episode, where it was actually like a very wet board, and we saw that it was okay for us to three barrel. Here we're seeing it's a very dry board, so therefore your opponent doesn't have a heck of a lot, and therefore he has a weak hand right off the bat on the flop, and can't call down. And so you can see that's one kind of question to ask yourself, that I've kind of been touching on, is that you can say, how often does my opponent have something or will make something that can actually call down three barrels? Um, and a lot of times you'll find that the answer to that is not very often. So it just comes to looking at these board textures and, you know, trying to predict that again. And I think these two so far are kind of, you know, obviously I cherry picking board textures to kind of highlight the examples and the concepts that I want to talk about, but you know, that makes for easier learning. So I want to talk about one more before we wrap up today. Okay, so the last board texture I want to talk about today is the Ace 7-5 two-tone. Ace of clubs, seven of clubs, five of hearts. And again, in all of these board textures, or examples rather, I'm looking at the exact same pre-flop range, us open on the button and fish call in the big blind. And so what are some things that we're going to see on this board texture? Is you get some folds on the flop. Um, this is just the gray would be our estimate on how often he's folding a flop, so about 44% of the time. Um, and we can see how often does he have top pair, 20% of the time on the flop. Here's his good draws, which by good draws I mean open enders and flush draws. Um, One thing that, to know, and I've talked about this a lot in videos, but it's just so important and so misunderstood that I can't really say it enough, is everybody thinks everybody has a flush draw all the time. I mean, keep in mind, this has got the open-enders in it too, and we're still at only 8% of his pre-flop range has made a good draw. He's got 7% of it, roughly, has a gut shot. So, doesn't happen a whole bunch. So what we want to take a look at here, we've been, the theme of the day is barreling. So let's take a look with this once he's called. So this would be once he's called if we looked at his group only. And now things are a little bit different than in the other board textures that we talk about because now the second he's called, he is top pair, roughly a third of the time. And part of that is like, I mean, he doesn't have. I didn't let him call the flop like fours, threes, and twos, thinking that like with three overcards, one of them being an ace, he might fold those. And maybe you even get him to fold like a five on the flop for that matter. Which means betting the flop and giving up is cool. But as far as barreling goes, not as fun. So the problem that we have is you can see we're gonna just run into a lot more top pair. And top pair doesn't get weaker like it does on the other boards. On these other two boards, the best parts of his range, like on the 10 high board, 10-7-2 rainbow, the best part of his range it was top pair and it could become not top pair, could get overcarded. On 5-5-2, if there's some trips, but you're looking at a lot of ace highs and middle pocket pairs that, either the A side doesn't improve or the pocket pair gets overcarded. So his hand strength can go down in value a lot there. And as for a significant percentage of his range. Here, that's not so much. I mean, you're probably still getting called by middle pair on a decent number of turn cards. Maybe you can get him to fold a seven on like some queens and things like that. But all the while, you're still got an issue because you're running into those aces so much. Um, and it's going to be very hard for you to get him to fold the ace. Um, so you're not going to get nearly as many folds on the turn. You can see like if we look back at so let's say, compare this to the 10-7-2, for example. Let's bring this guy over. Comparative side to side. I mean, just looking on the turn, we were kind of expecting to get the gutters to fold, the naked overs to fold, and bottom pair to fold. And that right there is 26, about 40% of the time that we're thinking about getting the fold. Here, if we're just kind of starting just from those estimates, just assuming nothing crazy happens on the turn, and just using those raw numbers, now on the turn we're looking at getting bottom pair to fold. That's 14, and the gut shots to fold. That's 12. So now we're at 26%. So a lot less folds we should expect on the turn. You can see there's a lot more good draws in his range. That's because I made the board two-tone. Just to show you the difference in these sort of examples. And when we get to the river, now we're going to be looking at, 13 good draws um, 35 top pairs and 25 middle pairs. You can kind of think of it that way on the ace high board. And that's going to mean, I mean, you can see he's going to have top pair most of the time there. And you might have folded him off some middle pair on the turn, depending on the turn card. Sometimes he two pairs it. Sometimes he two pairs top pair plus and raises it, or already had it and raises it, sure. Um, but you can see here, I mean, there's less top pair in his range, and we're just going to, on the turn when we get called, we're going to be looking, yeah, we're going to get more folds on the turn, and just kind of is going to go. I want to think I forgot to mention this is, let me see if that's true. Yeah, about the same folds on the flop. So, but getting back to that point is, yeah, it's gonna all be, you need to look at the entirety of it. So it's like, yeah, I get about the same number of folds on the flop, but you're probably going to get less folds on the turn, and that we can see pretty clearly. Now, I would have to kind of go a few extra steps into this to see what sort of river folds we can expect. But with us not being able to get them, like on the 10 high board, we don't get them overcarded nearly as often. Um, so we should, and him just having top pair more often on an ace high board, we're going to expect him to be calling that river more often. So the turn bluff is going to work less, and the river bluff is going to work less. So this is overall just not going to be um, as good of a spot to start firing up. And when you know that your third barrel of your bluff isn't going to be effective, and you're not going to catch as many cards for it to be effective on, then you can't fire the second one in the first place nearly as frequently. So this sort of ace 7-5 board um, is a board that's okay to c-bet, assuming that your opponent isn't going to be like a superstation and be calling you with like the king highs and this stuff. Um, if that's the case, then you probably just throw like a little half pot c-bet out there and do okay. But this is not a board, for contrast, that we want to be going crazy doing a whole bunch of barreling on. The 10-7-2s and the 5-5-2s, those are much more examples of good boards to be barreling on. In the first video, we talked about, I think it was either King 10-8 or King 10-7 two-tone. That's still an okay board for us to be barreling on, because on that board, as compared to an A7-5, we will get our opponent actually having more middle pair, because people play more tens than they do sevens. And he'll have more like queen jacks than he does 8-6s and 6-4s. And so therefore we'll actually probably have more stuff that he gets to fold on the river. And so more draws, more middle pairs means probably more river folding. So that board is a bit better of a board texture for us to be through barreling. Also, just as simple as people play more aces than they do kings. So all things being equal, ace high board, king high board, people tend to have more top pair on an ace high board than a king high board. So that also means, you're going to tend to get a little bit more folds on the river because you're not running into top pair quite as frequently. So I think these are some pretty helpful examples, and definitely let me know if you guys have any questions on this stuff. This is, like I said, this some spots where you can kind of take some air, um, and find spots for you to be putting pressure on people. And I think putting pressure on people is maybe a better phrase to call it than bluffing. A lot of the times we're just assuming he's not going to fold top pair, and they might fold a little bit of their top pairs in these situations. I don't think that all fish call down with all top pair all the time. Not these sort of guys, and I've kind of got in mind. If you want to talk about the 70% VPIP calling stations, then I'm totally agree with you that they tend to just call down with top pair as long as the board doesn't get too ugly. So I think this is even maybe being a little bit pessimistic for us. So, if you find these spots to put pressure on them, again, not necessarily bluff them, put pressure on them put pressure on their weak ranges, make them fold their crappy hands. And instead of just showing down and letting them win with their crappy hands, and then actually making their strategy better. If they're going to call you with a crappy hand, and you're just going to bet once and then let them show it down, then them calling a flop with a crappy hand is totally okay. Um, Obviously, I'm making a bit of a generalization here, but that's going to work out fine in a lot of situations. So you're going to need, if they're going to be having a wide percentage of their range that's going to be folding, well, then bet again. Uh, you know, as simple as that sounds. So, and that's what these couple of videos are about, is finding board textures. And I know I'm saying it again, finding board textures where people will have large percentages of their range that will be willing to fold on the turn in the river. Um, and not about quote unquote bluffing. Everyone says you can't, don't bluff a fish, don't bluff a fish. I'm not trying to talk about bluffing, and bluffing seems to imply that we're trying to make him fold a good hand. I'm not talking about making people fold good hands. I'm talking about making them fold all that garbage that they have. So cool. Hopefully, this is clear. Let me know if you guys have any questions. This has been threads13 for deucescrack.com.